epistemology is something that seems to be really difficult. It's much easier, I think, to understand in comparison to things like ethics, right? Or determinism, right? Like this seems to be a little bit more difficult. Class. Icarus, did you wanted to come in? Okay, there you are. You said you wanted to ask me some questions after the video, and you're here, so.
One is for epistemology. One concept I think is really interesting is, and hard to deal with, which this video brought up, is, skepticism.
Yeah.
So one of the hard parts for dealing with ultimate skepticism, or, the super skepticism, is like the line of questioning of, basically just asking why you believe every single step of the way, because eventually you'll get to the point where, or some people would think that you get to the point where, like, you're questioning whether or not logic as a concept is even valid. And generally I think epistemology is most useful here, and I think there's a lot of different answers you can get to stuff like that from various philosophers. The one person that they mentioned, which I think might be a little interesting to you, was Descartes. Are you familiar with the evil demon argument?
No, but is it the argument that deals with, like, I think this guy was kind of mentioning it, like, a little bit. There's something going on in your brain, but it may be like an evil demon that's manipulating. I don't know, or something like that, right?
Descartes. So Descartes' whole thing was, father of modern philosophy. His whole claim to fame was his goal of kind of deconstructing all of his preconceived notions and then trying to build back up a system purely based on logical reasoning. This is called the rationalist school of thought. You're trying to build everything out of rationality rather than empirics. So Descartes, one of his fundamental arguments was that he operated through a system that at this point we call Cartesian Doubt, which was that anything that he thought you could have any level of doubt for, you doubted completely. So if there was any chance that something wasn't the case, then he didn't believe it.
Interesting.
And so he wanted to build a system out of stuff that he could fully believe every aspect of. So one of the arguments he gave in favor of this was the evil demon argument, which is basically to say that he has no reason not to believe that it is the case that there is an evil demon that is, in charge of all of creation. And the goal of that demon is to deceive him in everything, so that his sense perception, everything he sees, is all false. None of it is actually real. And so with this being a possibility, it would pose a lot of problems for him, because if he's operating under the theory of rational doubt, this would cast any of his empirical claims into doubt under his system. The solution to this that Descartes came to is a very popular saying that people know of now, which is the I think therefore I am argument, which Descartes' basic argument was that if there is said evil demon that is messing with all my sense perception, right, then there has to be a me that is being messed with in this hypothetical. So he believed that there was no kind of hypothetical that you construe that didn't involve himself. So the conclusion of that for Descartes was that no matter what, his self, he uses the word soul. You can basically interchange soul and mind with most older philosophy. And so his theory was that his mind was the kind of premier thing that he would build out of, that he built his logical scaffolding out of. That's one of the big hard questions of philosophy, and that argument leads you you're getting into a bunch of like metaphysics, like dualism versus
materialism, and stuff.
A bunch of other arguments that get derived from that. But that's one of the arguments that is, I think, interesting from him in particular.
I don't know if this was happening for you when you tried learning about this, but to me, it seems a lot more difficult, and like a lot more difficult to like comprehend and think about, especially when it comes to the skepticism of what we consider like our very like quote unquote common sense beliefs in comparison to other things like ethics. You know what I mean? And like other aspects of philosophy. It seems a lot more difficult to think about.
So it's also hard because philosophers are stupid in that they use the same word to mean like 16 different things. So if you look at the word idea and you go between Plato, Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, Kant, whoever you want, you'll see like 700 different definitions for the exact same word, and they'll never actually define it explicitly. That makes it really difficult to read a lot of the time and to kind of like approach the concept, because it leads to a lot of confusion in a lot of these philosophical positions that just become difficult to understand. It's one of the reasons I really like recommending Problems of Philosophy, because I think in that book Russell does a good job of kind of outlining the different terms that he uses and why he uses them.
Isn't it important? Like isn't one of the reasons why there's so many definitions, because like a lot of these philosophers will build off that definition, right? Like so like you mentioned like the word idea, or like i.e. like soul or consciousness. Like, isn't one of the reasons why they're used differently is because people their arguments are like based off of this like different idea of that.
The thing I've been reading more about recently is philosophical history, which is a pain in the ass because you also have to get into general history. But and the thing you realize the second you get into any philosophical history is you realize that a big reason there's a lot of confusion among philosophers is because you can draw like very different trajectories on who philosophers learned from, and at the roots they had similar terms that were different, right? So if you have philosopher A learning from another philosopher, right, and you have philosopher B learning from another different philosopher, and those two different philosophers use different terms, then philosophers A and B will use those same terms differently, right? And that ends up like branching out into a tree of all of these various different philosophers who hold different positions.
You were talking about like biology earlier, and you're like, oh, biology sucks, right? Like,
I fucking hate biology.
Yeah, I don't like it that much either. But it's like it's a completely different type of like, you're thinking about biology, but you're not really thinking. You know what I mean? A lot of it is off the basis of like it's like empirical knowledge, and then like application of that in situations. Whereas like philosophy is like does this empirical knowledge even exist? Should we even use this for application? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, well, it gets even harder. So because the different schools of thought in philosophy have such different roots, it leads you to all these really different weird justificatory facts. Like if you're trying to read anything on like rationalism, you're reading math, like mathematicians, you know, you're reading like all these different math guys, and so you're going to be basically reading math books. But the second you start reading anything that is marginally teleological, anything that bases a lot of its justifications off religions or mysticism, it's it's a very different type of reading. Like if you try and read any Eastern philosophy, or if you try and read older philosophy, so like pre-Greek, like pre-Socratic, it's a very different type of philosophy to reading like Aristotle or something. Which makes it even harder because these ideas still play into each other. You can still like trace the influence of like Confucianism, Taoism, whatever, on more modern Western philosophical thought, but those foundational texts are written in a wholly different manner than the more modern, you know, philosophical prose.
So they're getting to the same like kind of conclusions, but like had completely different like premises and shit, right?
It's not even necessarily same conclusions. It's the different modern day philosophical schools of thought are built off of other schools of thought that come from very different bases, whether that be mathematical, whether that be spiritual, mystical, right? Ultimately, the super reductionist take, but I think it helps explain the point, is like you can kind of draw these two lines in philosophy of like mysticism and more logic, like scientific thought, and these two types of philosophy intertwine and intermix in their influence on philosophy. So you're not just engaging in like quote unquote philosophy, you're engaging in these two very different types of readings that are both like equally important to understanding everything, which makes it super difficult.
I think the part you're talking about Descartes and like rebuilding a system, right? Like it's something that's really interesting. Like sometimes I'll think about how much fun would it be to like you know like the Anarchy server, you ever heard of it? Yeah, so like it's really interesting like to just think about like redesigning a complete society from like the ground up. Right, that's something that I think the Austrians do, right? Like how does Descartes relate to like the Austrians, who will build off like a whole economic view off the basis of just pure rationalism? Why did Descartes not use empiricism, and why is it like so common that so many groups just don't like use it?
Empiricism is still like, so as a philosophy, right, you have the kind of contrast between empiricism and rationalism, right? Do we want to derive our knowledge from rationality, or do we want to derive from empirics? And empiricism at the time of Descartes was still a very, very popular philosophy. When you're getting into why philosophers approach things in the ways that they did, Honestly, a lot of the time it just has to do with how they were raised. They're like who they were as a person. So Descartes was raised in, I think it was a Jesuit high school. History nerd's gonna blow me the fuck out on that later.
Ted isn't here. You're fine. You're fine.
Okay, I'm good. So I think it was a Jesuit high school, and from his own kind of reflections and statements about his past, he ultimately was really unsatisfied with the ability of science to explain things. He found the explanations science gave very unsatisfactory. So what Descartes ended up doing actually was basically going out on his own, and I wish someone wrote like a biography of every single philosopher that I could just read through, because they're all very interesting.
There is someone I don't know, I don't know if it's a philosophical like I don't know if it was a book on philosophical thought, or like a book of like historians and their philosophical thought, but there's like you may already know about this, but it's a history of Western philosophy or something.
I'm reading that book right now.
Oh, you are? Yeah. Someone recommended that to me. Is it good?
It's good. It's 1,400 pages.
Oh no.
So, I mean, if you want the commitment, it's super good. Okay. Context on a lot of stuff with Bertrand Russell. A lot of the stuff he says about pre-Hellenistic thought, even up to like Hellenistic thought, is generally really good, and everything post-Descartes he says is really good. There's a lot of contest in more modern philosophical history about the view that older philosophers gave of like the Middle Ages, because there was a very common view that everything pre-Descartes, post-Aristotle was like the dark ages of philosophy. There was very little new thought. That's a more contested view of the philosophical history now. So you'd want to take that section with a grain of salt. But overall, I love Russell's like writing style. I think he just has a very genuinely like entertaining way of reading things, and he covers like a lot of the funny parts about philosophy. Pythagoras was really fucking funny. Pythagoras was actually a very mystical philosopher.
Really?
His whole religion that he built was basically around social taboos. So you weren't allowed to eat beans. You had to press your bed sheets and then roll them up after sleeping in them. You weren't allowed to break bread. You weren't allowed to. There's like a bunch of all this random, super weird shit.
I'd always heard stuff from like math teachers and crap about that. So it is funny. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's how the math teachers get everybody interested. They just mention all the dumb shit Pythagoras did. Pythagoras was also really influential in the more scientific schools of philosophical thought because of his, creation of geometric proofs. So there's a line of like the development of logical argumentation in Greece. Greece is like, the more you read about philosophical history, you realize just how important Greece was as a civilization.
I once did a project. I did a project recently. It was like Plato and the Stoics, right? And like how important they were, and even like I was specifically their impact on like determinism and such as. So like Greece is really influential when it comes to philosophy.
Greece is really influential when it comes to anything. Greece was a very, very interesting culture. But the development of like the argument. Basically the development of the argument is traced back to a couple of Greek individuals, Pythagoras being one of them. Another important one being Zeno, who, mentioning Stoics, Zeno was one of the first Greek Stoics. He was the kind of one of the origins of Greek Stoic thought, which, just to be specific, is distinct from the more the later Hellenistic Stoic thought that ended up being less materialistic and more spiritual and religious, that kind of led into later Christianity. So Zeno was a big part of developing that. Parmenides is another philosopher who had some fun, interesting ideas, but he is I believe he's the first known example of someone laying out a logical, almost like a syllogism for his argument. In a poem, it's something virtue, and I'm not going to remember the name. But Parmenides is really important for that reason. Parmenides is also important. He held the belief of that everything was the same. This was what his argument was for: is that nothing changed, everything was like the same. The argument was because words refer to objects, and we use words to refer to things in the past and the future. then those words must be referring to objects that exist now. Therefore, the past and the future exist now. Therefore, there is no change. Was essentially his argument.
Do you know? Do you remember? Do you ever remember that clip of Infrared talking about words? Specifically referring to like he was talking about political terms, and he tried applying that to fascism, right? Referred to something in the past. I think he tried making that argument in and of itself as like the way that we deal with words.
I like black out half of the stuff Infrared said, so it's probably...
You may want to look like this. May be interesting for you. Is there was a conversation that he had with Destiny.
No, I saw that.
You saw that?
Though.
Okay.
I was so shocked he was that intelligent about philosophy. It's not even like a thing about irrelevant from whether or not his points were actually correct. The fact that he even knew like the names that he was talking about was shocking to me.
Didn't expect it either, but like that word point is interesting. Like everything is now is that nothing changes or everything doesn't change.
It was basically what Parmenides said, was that nothing changed, and that was a big hot point of like Greek thought was like theories of change. You had the guy on the opposite side of it, Heraclitus. Heraclitus basically said the complete opposite, that everything was change. I think the quote from him that's well known is, a man never steps into the same river twice. So his whole thing was everything was in a constant state of flux and was, never the same thing. But Parmenides played a big role in the development of the kind of discourse. Then you had Socrates, of course. It's hard to talk about Socrates because we actually don't know a lot about Socrates.
Really?
We know a bunch about the Platonic Socrates. So basically, Socrates didn't actually write anything that we know of, at least as far as I'm aware of. He was portrayed primarily by Plato and another person who was he worked in the military, and I'm not going to remember his name. But we only know Socrates by these accounts. And the issue is that Plato would often ascribe Platonic beliefs to Socrates that weren't necessarily Socratic beliefs. We do have more historical accounts. If you ever want to read something that we are fairly certain is like of the essence of Socrates, is one of Plato's dialogues, Apologia. And this is basically the Plato's account of what Socrates said at Socrates' trial.
That trial case is really interesting because is that the one that deals with pious and non-pious? Is it that case?
You might be thinking of Euthyphro.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Euthyphro, but Socrates, Euthyphro also had his own case or something, right?
So in terms of the the Platonic timeline, Euthyphro literally takes place like right before Socrates' trial. Socrates is going to his trial and he meets Euthyphro and then has that dialogue there. That's how it fits in.
Speaking of that, I think you ever played Assassin's Creed?
Yeah.
You play Assassin's Creed Odyssey?
No.
Assassin's Creed Odyssey has a little dialogue with Socrates, and I think I remember that's why I remember his case. I don't remember what it was about, but I remember like as a character, like you go mess around with Socrates or something.
Yeah. Socrates' case was basically the fucking Spartan puppet government just getting really pissy that Socrates was speaking.
Yeah, I remember that. There's a mission where you have to smuggle him out of Greece or something. Yeah, it's something like that.
Well, so assuming we accept the accounts of Plato of Socrates to be true, Crito, a friend of Socrates, offered to smuggle him out, and Socrates ultimately refused and was executed by drinking hemlock. Those like Socratic dialogues, I think the 5 dialogues is what they're called. There's a set of 5 dialogues, which is Euthyphro, Apologia, Meno, Crito, and Phaedo. Those 5 dialogues are all very interesting in terms of like foundations of like metaphysics and like metaphysical thought when it comes to more modern philosophy. They advanced a lot of the arguments around the division of the body and soul, the immortality of the soul. Euthyphro talks a lot about how we define piety, which is an interesting dilemma.
Yeah, Euthyphro dilemma, I've used it a couple times in arguments. It's really interesting. And it sucks that it was actually like, it was weird to me because whenever I would hear, and it was never in like the atheist YouTube community or any of that stuff, but it was really interesting to hear like something that I'd never heard before, right? This is never talked about. I had to go out of my way and like find this, but it's like it's hyper interesting when it comes to like morality. And it's really interesting to hear people who will like argue like colloquially, not really like people who like debate philosophy all the time, but like regular people, when they try to justify the existence of God or not, or whether we should follow like his moral rules, and the society that he puts, no one ever brings it up, and it's like it's like a very clear dilemma. So I think it's interesting.
With arguments about God, I think there's so many interesting, very, very simple arguments you can pose that tend to be the two classic ones that are, I think are very good is the problem of omniscience and the problem of evil. The problem of evil I've heard better retorts to than I have heard about the problem of omniscience.
What's the problem of evil? What's that one?
So the problem, if God is fully benevolent.
Yeah.
If God's fully benevolent, evil exists. God is omniscient, so how can God let evil exist? If he lets it happen, then he's not benevolent. If he can't fix it, then he's not omnipotent.
Yeah, I think I've heard that one.
The problem of omniscience is basically, can an omnipotent being, like, there's an infinite way to formulate the argument. Can an infinite being create a rock that they can't move? Can an infinite being create a piece of paper that they cannot tear? You can phrase it in however many ways you want.
I've actually heard some people try to say that there's a counter to the problem of omnipotence, but I haven't heard it. Right? Like I've heard.
I haven't either. I'm sure there is. It was just an argument that I've heard that I really liked for its simplicity. I've just never heard the good kind. I'm sure they exist. They're probably philosophers much smarter than I am who've talked about it.
This is something that I find really interesting, and maybe my view of determinism is a little weak on here, but like, if God can see into the future, but if free will exists, how can he see a future?
It's really hard to get around this argument, which is that if there is a being that has ultimate knowledge about everything in the universe, how can you have free will? This just gets into people, I think, defining, like, I have met people who think that because QM says that ultimately everything is random, we still have free will, is like an argument for why free will exists. They're basically biting the bullet that things are still determined, it's just you're just determined by random chance. It's not even like you're necessarily making the choice, just random itself.
I've also heard that like the way to approach that is adequate determinism, where it's like even though quantum randomness can exist, when it comes to like actual much larger physical effects, it's like this micro effect doesn't affect it on a macro level. Big one would be that, like, sure, quantum randomness still exists, but if I push a can off a table, the table still falls.
The main issue I run into with people who like cite randomness is typically that often just feels to me like, instead of saying that our choices are ultimately determined by some Newtonian framework of like natural laws, they're just determined by dice rolls, which I don't know how much better that is in the case of like a free will argument. The only like major difference you can make is you're saying, a person can't predict out all of the decisions that are going to get made because they're random, but calling that free will just feels very weird to me, because you're still basically conceding that you yourself don't really have any direct control over your actions.
Most people, now that I think about it, who will talk about free will all the time, I don't think like they'll engage with the fact that that the will is metaphysical. I didn't realize like that had to be like that's an important part of the argument, that it's something that transcends the physical state, right?
I've thought about this a little bit. The one question I've been running into, which I'm not actually sure on the answer yet, is whether or not compatibilism falls under the same category. I'm leaning towards the answer being no.
Whether compatibilism like engages with the idea of the will being metaphysical?
Well, no. Whether or not compatibilism requires the will to be.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'm leaning towards the answer being no there, largely because at the point you bite the bullet that you think that things are determined, you just believe that the concept of free will still applies. I think at that point I mean, it depends on how you're, the type of compatibilism you're talking about, but I feel like you're at a distinct enough position where I don't know if it's necessary for it to be but sorry, free will generally, people not being it's really funny if you ever want to like own someone who is really into Randian thought, bringing up that point is really fucking funny to watch them flounder around when they try to justify objectivism and like everything being material, and the fact that they believe in the free will is really funny. Astrology or astronomy now used to be considered a philosophical concept, and the second we realized it actually was like scientific, it was no longer philosophy. It was astronomy. It was a whole different thing. Same thing with psychology, because the study of like the mind and the way the mind worked used to be a philosophical thing. Then it became, we were like, oh shit, this is a science, and that got pulled away. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But the point Russell makes, which at this point I really agree with, is that one of the most, if not the most important part of philosophy is teaching us to think about things regardless of ourself. Trying to remove ourself from the process of thought is really important for achieving like correct thoughts about things. And philosophy is really, really good about promoting that type of thought. And I think when you approach philosophy from that angle, rather than from the angle of like trying to find definitive, hard answers to these massive questions, I think it's a lot healthier of a way to approach the subject of like trying to retrain your brain to think rather than find these really hard answers to questions.
I did a project that was looking at like I was in my screenwriting class. I took a class, this is my senior year, so I took it for fun and it seemed cool, and we were looking at like ways to approach like movies and like film, and one of the approaches was like philosophical. I took it, and I was just like, I was reading through it, and you're right, like completely right when it comes to the way that like philosophy and science were viewed. And at least I forget which was it, at some point in Greek history, philosophy and science used to be one and the same, and then it's split, right? Like from my understanding. Yeah. But I think like when it comes to the way that we just handle questions, like the most relevant political example will come to me is that like if I'm presented with a policy, like how would I determine whether I believe this policy is good or wrong, right? Like and that I can go back to ethics, yada yada yada. But it really is just a way of like, how do I think about this question? Well, like for me, if it may be some form of like consequentialism, it's me looking at like the effects of this. As I do it, this is a good policy because of the effects of it. If I look this from like a Kantian perspective, does it affect the way that I view duty? Is it like a duteous principle? Would I want this to be applied to everyone? Yada yada yada. And I think you're completely 100% right. Like more than anything, it is really the little bit of philosophy that I've engaged with has just really helped me engage with questions a lot better. It helped me give me more answers, but there are still some that'll like, at least in my lifetime, in our lifetimes, that we'll never have the answer to.
I think we eventually have to accept there is going to be some limits to our current ability to question things, and that might change over time. But that's like beyond us as like individuals. It's very unlikely that is we're going to be able to influence that. And so what's important is doing what you're talking about, just kind of looking for the alternate ways that we can derive value from philosophy, which I think there's a lot of value that you can derive from it. It's one of those things where it's like a lot of people meme about having like mandatory economic courses, which we should have. Okay, fucking illiterate people, get them out.
True.
But having some form of like philosophy course be, if not mandatory for like all of your high school years, have it at least as like a mandatory like elective that somebody can choose or something, because people who are able to like engage in philosophy in that way, just in my like anecdotally, I just find that people who are able to engage with conversations in that way tend to be way more able to have other conversations productively.
I was watching a TikTok. I don't know how much TikTok you watch, Chris. But like, there was like this conversation. It was like, wow, like, you know, like it was this girl and she was talking about like all the guys want to have like all the guys that are trying to get with me always want to have deep conversations, and like they're deep, like they're. And I was reading the comments. It was like, it was really interesting to hear what people thought were like deep questions. What was more interesting was hearing the answers. Right? What I feel like we lose when we don't teach people about philosophy is like you're restarting, right? Like you're kind of doing what Descartes is doing, from what I've heard, is that like you're engaging in a system that you're building by yourself, and you aren't using all of this thought that could like project you further. And that's what sucks about it not being taught in classes. So many people have to restart all this philosophical thought when there's so much like precedent, so much like prior reading that could help you answer these questions, rather than you completely going at it as an individual, people who just don't know that much about it. It's really interesting that way.
In the book I sent you, I can point out like 6-7 passages, right? You can get through it in like 10 minutes of philosophy that will make you infinitely more able to engage with like philosophical questions than any layman who hasn't just read like the bare minimum. And like any type of academic subject, philosophy gets exponentially the amount of reading you need to engage with to answer like questions deeper and deeper gets like exponentially greater as you move on, right? Like to answer that at the base level, you need like a couple minutes of reading, and then you're getting to like, what's like foundational knowledge that we can know? How can I contribute to the discourse? And you're reading like 16 people's 12,000, treatise on these various ideas. So, but I mean, I firmly believe, just from my like brief engagement with the topic, that there's some like, smaller amount of reading that's pretty reasonable for any person to engage with, that's so helpful in analyzing.
Wow, what a conversation, chat. What a conversation. Icarus, what a smart guy. What a smart fellow Zoomer.